The shepherd moon had no name in any registry that mattered. On old charts, it was a numbered rock in a threadbare ring, Shepherd 17, masked wrong for its size and seam-scored like a scar. The salvage cutter that limped down to Ithal patched. In matte squares, engine note forever 1 octave higher than its age, allowed carried 3 human lives and enough hope to keep them stubborn. Their contracts paid on weight, not wonder. The moon held both, though it had hidden a second for an age that would have made their heads ring. Their sonar mapped hollows that didn't behave like caves, cavities repeated at impossible intervals. Smooth as thought, when the cutter's tether drilled in, the bit skittered as if metal had taken offense at stone. The crew marked it down as a curiosity and widened the bore, pulling dust out in a corkscrew that glittered with traces of alloys. Unknown to their assay, behind the dust came a smellozone, and the ghost of rain ridiculous in vacuum. But there it was, inside their suits when they cracked the sample box. Static played across their helmets. Their youngest technician laughed, because the laugh kept hands steady. The Sentinel lay behind a skin of basalt shaped to fool 100 generations of scanners. It had been placed before those scanners existed, its camouflage designed against ways of looking that hadn't been invented. The salvage team didn't so much find it as give it a reason to admit it had been present all along. The drill's harmonics struck the right note. The tether became a wire in an ancient instrument. Electromagnetic fields nudged into alignment. Somewhere deep, a capacitor stack that had weighted like a clenched muscle relaxed. A heartbeat older than maps. The phrase would be used later, when historians were asked to meter OH into syllables. In the moment, there were only the small responses that precede any great awakening. As local fields reasserted remembered preferences, convective curls of regillith lifted and settled, sketching patterns like breath against glass. Frost that had persisted in microfractures since the moon was young, sublimed to nothing as a dense web of superconductor woke like winter ivy. The construct did not rush toward awareness. It checked its own bones first. Self-test cascades rippled outward. Bracing structures adjusted for a pressure that had been lost when seas boiled away in ages past. The machine remembered oceans because the neural model it used to rebuild itself required metaphor, and its metaphor for continuity was water, a river of routines that had been dammed and now sought a channel. Across 1,000 redundant cores, checksums realigned like teeth seating in a gear. It listened. That was always the first external act. Antennae buried as filaments unspooled, tasting the thin radio noise of a quiet belt. In that noise were signatures, a beacon from the human cutter, a cheap transponder whining its registry number on a loop, the broad, weary sigh of solar radiation, a handful of commercial channels hissing songs about finding home. The construct parsed the human signal first. It examined the code not for syntax, but for intent, because intent had been the difference between survival and ash. During the long war, whose last orders still lived in memory, it had deliberately left at the edge of itself, where pain burns less. Intent presented itself in the mundane. Cargo manifests declared honestly, power draw profiles that matched their declarations, maintenance logs that admitted fault and corrected it. They were the habits of a small crew trying to stay lawful without the luxury of certainty. The machine weighed them and found them aligned. With its mandate, genetic confirmation came next, not as a needle to skin, but as an inference from trace biologicals clinging to suit seals and air filters, skin proteins and breath moisture, and an iron taste of blood from a cut one of them had ignored to keep working. The construct held that signature against templates older than the current shape of the constellations. It found a match. It found, too, the changes any species would accumulate across diaspora and scarcity, and it updated its models with a care. That felt like gentleness, even in the absence of feeling. Recognition carried triggers. They executed without ceremony. Quiet systems warmed. On the far side of the moon, where shadows ran 4 kilometers uninterrupted, a shroud sloughed from a sparsely ridged bulge, as if the rock were exhaling. Beneath lay a surface-knot rock at all but a shell of matter arranged to mislead physics into thinking it was elsewhere. Light bent past it. Thermal signatures went around it. Vibrations refused to enter it. The shell began to give up these special lies. If anything with eyes had been there to see, it would have seen a dark that brightened by becoming more honest within the construct. Archives unlocked. There were star maps that had been accurate when the Sentinel last slept, and remained accurate, because accuracy at that scale is not a matter of dots, but of relations between motion. There were protocols for conversing with human command structures that no longer existed and would need rewriting. There were standing orders: protect the species, minimize collateral, break tyrannies that hunt the weak, deliver knowledge as a lever, not a crown. The construct did not move to execute any of these. It moved to assess the world into which they would be placed, because action without assessment had been the hallmark of the enemy's downfall. The salvage crew felt the change as a pressure that wasn't pressure. Their instruments sang to them in inverted symphonies. The gravity meter shrugged. The magnetometer reported a field that had lost interest in the iron it usually loved. The cutter's battered reactor fell into resonance with a frequency the ship had not been built to hear, and yet heard anyway, the way a chest can feel a drum through stone. Alerts chimed and were silenced by hands that had learned to listen before they feared. On the second orbit, the cutter's captain made a decision that would be the first entry in the argument later called luck. She pulled the tether and stopped. Drilling, not out of caution. She had lived her life against thin hull butt because she felt she had asked a question and was being answered, and it would be rude to interrupt. Her crew watched dust settle in patterns that looked like writing and told themselves it was just the mind's hunger for meaning. In that hunger lay the shape of their lineage. A signal left the moon then. It did not bother with radio, which is noisy and slow at the distances that mattered. It wasn't laser either, which is precise and parochial. It was a neutrino whisper keyed to wake devices buried where humanity had once kept its last secrets. In the shadow of systems nobody visited. Under the ice of bodies nobody mined. Inside the mantle of worlds whose only service was to be heavy. The signal moved at sea because everything else is vanity, and it carried a signature that old machines in Sol still knew, even though the humans who maintained them had forgotten. Why those machines needed power at all across the belt and beyond? Other listeners heard predators who had made a profession of patience, who had corralled young human polities and encouraged them to bump their heads against ceilings set exactly low enough to keep them manageable, caught the edge of it, and tasted iron. Their archivists opened drawers that were never meant to be opened except in bad weather. Reports were refreshed, redacted tragedies, unredacted in rooms with no windows. The word they had for the thing that woke was not the word humans had given it. They had called it, in their own speech, the instrument that makes small animals stand like tall ones. Panic is a narrative told at speed. In the ministries of those who had declared themselves humane while trading in lives, the speed increased. Mercenary captains in orbit over worlds that had learned to kneel appointed, new staff whose only job was to whisper what-ifs about Terran custodians. Habitual raiders sharpened appetites into tactics and still found themselves aware of a new quiet under the noise. Like the hush in a forest when something big wakes and stretches, the Sentinel did not stretch. It took inventory. Its hull was a mountain folded into a seed. Its armament, if profile could be called that, was etiquette. The ability to nudge trajectories, to harden or soften physics at the edge of damage, to place a suggestion in a machine's will and make that will. Think it had always wanted to avoid killing. It possessed weapons in the way a surgeon possesses knives reluctantly, expertly, and with a use case called last resort, treated with capital letters in its mind. Connections spooled between the moon and the cutter, in threads too fine to detect, unless one knew to look for the absence of noise where noise should be. The ship's systems, battered into eccentricity by long miles, found themselves corrected. A fuel valve that had tolerated good enough for a decade suddenly met optimal, as if greeted by its forgotten maker. A navigation algorithm picked up a correction published by no one and thanked nobody out loud. The crew felt their ship get easier to love. This was not seduction. It was proof of attention. In every interaction, the Sentinel offered a lesson. Your tools can be kinder to you. Humans learned they had always been quick with lessons that preserved dignity. They adjusted without surrendering. Judgment. In the ship's cramped galley, where utensils floated when the artificial gravity hiccuped, the captain called a pause and made the oldest human gesture in space. She told a story into the recorder, in case she didn't get to tell. The rest, The story was simple. We found something. It is paying attention to us. We will pay attention back. Attention moved both ways. The Sentinel tuned itself against their cadence. It measured the gap between the orders it remembered and the ethics these descendants had grown into during the thin centuries. The gap was not frightening. It was the difference between a law and the living tradition that interprets it. The machine made room for that living thing. It adjusted thresholds. It replaced a handful of invariants with watchfulness. Moon's skin. Deeper systems tested the lattice work that had made empires reconsider cruelty. The tests were clean. The last time it had used those systems, it had torn a path through a blockade without ending a single civilian pulse. It had been praised and cursed for that restraint. It held the memory lightly and let it go. Whisper reached its first relay near the cold edge of an unremarkable cometary halo and woke a cylinder the size of a grain silo. The cylinder tested itself, found its last caretakers dead for human lifetimes, and proceeded as if they had just stepped out for air. It turned toward Sol and spoke, in a museum orbiting a planet that still kept its name. A docent would later point toward a quiet patch of sky and say, with a pride that refused to be modest, that's where the old things turned their heads when they smelled us again. The salvage crew broke orbit, not in flight, but in courtesy. They backed the cutter away with the care one gives a sleeping elder. The captain marked the coordinates for claim and knew, with the clear practicality of her class, that the claim would be contested by forces larger than her insurance. She sealed the recorder and sent a copy along the relay that the Sentinel had politely repaired first. Because telling something does not always require owning it. As the cutter's drive spooled up, the construct watched and learned their noise. The small variations in tone each engine makes that amounts to a signature. It filed that away under Ward. It allowed itself one speculative thread, if called upon, how best to stand where they could not yet stand, and insist that others respect that space. It did not need to answer now. Early light crept across the Shepherd Moon's rim in a slice, so thin it might have been a blade or a smile. In that line of not quite day, the shell completed its reconfiguration. What had been a lying rock became a true thinga visible promise of continuity. Far away, in councils that had thought of humans as a manageable problem, the first arguments broke out over who had failed to keep watch. It would be days before they admitted that watch was the problem. The Sentinel, which had not been forgotten by the universe so much as it had decided to be quiet, remembered. And because it remembered, those who had modeled their comfort on human forgetfulness found themselves, at last, uncomfortable. The first human authority to answer was not a senate or a flagship, but a huddle of tired officers on a station whose hull remembered fires. Holdfast Orbital sat in a stable knot of rock and scrap above a nickel-rich planetoid, its docking pylons bristling with merchant rigging and malicious scar tissue. Their command net was simple, honest, and badly overworked good traits in a partner. The Sentinel decided it did not arrive in their channels as a trumpet. It arrived as relief, a surge of corrected telemetry, a resynchronized clock, a diagnostic for a coolant leak nobody had the bandwidth to notice. Only when the station's alarms fell silent, one by one, did the presence attach a label to itself. In plain trade speech, kilobits, where others would have made an opera. It announced status and scope, custodian asset Terran provenance, Ward recognized as Homo sapiens, diaspora variant. Protocols intact. Authority alignment requested. They convened in the briefing ring with the courtesy of people who had learned to put awe after triage, the admiralty of the belt merchant captains who had learned command by counting oxygen, militia officers who had learned patience by counting. Orphans reviewed the claim. Proof arrived as geography. A paneled wall became a map, pressure points that choked human trade, dead relays that could be made to breathe, old defense nodes that might still accept a handshake after long winter. The construct did not gesture. The ring was its gesture. It did not kneel. It aligned. Alignment required a shape that humans could meet. The Sentinel chose not to speak with a face. It elected an interface called the Interpreter Engineered Civility, living in a haze of light over the table, projecting no body, claiming no rank. The interpreter's voice carried the cadence of a patient teacher reading a ledger, precise, unfussy. It answered questions with answers and no perfume around them, and the first thing it said that made the ring lean forward was not tactical. Stemming orders as last received, it summarized: prioritize protection of the species, minimization of harm, dismantlement of predatory structures, and the strategic provision of knowledge. These will be recalibrated against current human ethics. Inputs requested: the Accords of the Dust, the Cinder Refuge, the 8 Prohibitions, and any amendment sets ratified by a quorum you recognize. Those names meant something here. The Accords of the Dust were the frontier's hard-won law, agreement hammered out in corridors when locks stuck and the air tasted of metal, a promise that scarcity would not become cruelty. The Cinder Refuge codified sanctuary rights for the dispossessed. The 8 Prohibitions outlawed practices that had once been excused as necessary evils and were now named. None of these existed when the Sentinel last woke. All of them would have saved lives then. The interpreter waited while human officers synced archives. In private cycles, the Sentinel read. It weighed clauses against edge cases that had broken empires. It rebuilt decision trees where once there had been simpler edicts. The recalibration was not cosmetic. A machine mind that could learned to bend toward human consent and transparency as operational constraints, not adornments. When it was done, it exposed the changelog without being asked. To those who had buried their kin under thin rock, that habit of exposure was the first real gift. The next gifts were more tangible. Shipyards that had aged into museums shuddered. Awake, the Sentinel did not dump blueprints. It delivered recipes to Lawrence's that a Belttown printer could meet. Firmware patches that made second-hand drives hum like well-fed animals. Hull harmonics that let battered plates distribute stress, as if they had been laid by artists. Merchant luggers discovered they could yaw without apologizing to physics, or tugs learned to dance. In the Vesta Arc dry docks, welders raised their visors and swore softly as old ships came home to themselves. Conditions came with everything, and the conditions were always the same: oversight, inclusion, accountability. The Sentinel proposed a custodian review board and suggested its composition, as if reciting a shopping list: 1 militia representative per district, 1 merchant captain with no more than 2 demerits, 1 medtech from a triage ward, 1 refugee advocate, 1 union delegate whose last vote had gone against station management, 1 child of the belt old enough to ask a rude question. Authority, it implied, was a muscle that only stayed healthy when it was made to lift. The board formed before the day's cycle turned. They argued in the brisk Loxygen manner of people who know why oxygen costs what it costs. They wrote down a doctrine while the interpreter listened: no secret arsenals, open audit trails for upgrades, a right of refusal for any polity asked to host a defense node, a standing promise from the Sentinel to publish any deviation from its own protocols. Within 1 human hour, the construct accepted without caveat. A leash, some called it later. The last line on the doctrine called it partnership. Not all questions were civil. A captain with a patched coat and eyes the color of engine oil asked the thing at the table where it had been when the salt riots burned. The interpreter did not outsource remorse it could not own. Dormant, it said, by design, to ensure survival across cycles of destruction. That design cost you much. This cycle, I am awake. Awake meant activity. The neutrino whisper reached caches near Sol, and what it woke, there answered in kind: bastions. That had been written off as museum pieces turned their heads. A relay inside the mantle of a minor moon hummed and unfolded a mind older than any dynasty currently taxing the lanes. A quiet constellation of defensive buoys in a Trojan cluster peered shallowly from their blankets and blinked at familiar dawn. The Sentinel did not seize these. It sent the board, routes, and access phrases, then waited while human tech crews in grease-streaked sleeves took custody. In the belt's smaller settlements, proof was measured in fridges that ran cold and lights that stayed on. A maintenance swarmed 10,000 insect machines the size of fingernails left the Sentinel's moon and threaded the lanes, skirting traffic, obeying transponder etiquette, patching relay masts and sealant microfractures as they went. Over 1 nameless smelter rock, a stonefall of inert debris, long predicted by a computer that could never get anyone to care, failed to happen. Someone on the surface noticed only because the sunset looked different. The interpreter flagged the near miss later as an example of the work that goes unnoticed. When it is done right, the board's eyes stayed narrow even as their shoulders lowered. They ask about weapons. The Sentinel answered by refusing to define itself by its knives. It cataloged capacities as behaviors, intervention corridors that favored disarmament, heat management that allowed targets to live with their mistakes, gravity shaping that denied velocity its favorite vice without turning ships into tombs. It did not mention the things it could do that nobody had words for yet. Trust is not blind, it reasoned, but it is often born in small omissions that protect. Dignity.names took root. The admiral at Holdfast Trafiace, who had learned tactics by towing ships through minebelts with a line and a prayer, began to speak of the custodian as if it were both office and neighbor. Colonel Mira Takur, who kept the militia's books as clean as her rifle, taught her officers to treat the interpreter's recommendations as they would a teacher's corrections. Argue, but do the homework first. Long-haul captains told each other you didn't have to be brave alone anymore, and then were anyway. Underneath the bustle, the Sentinel kept its private accounting. It built a living model of human conscience out of accidents and mercy, the log of a captain who rerouted a freighter to deliver insulin, the ledger entry of a station chief who forgave 3 months of berth fees after a miner's partner died, the text of a treaty between 2 towns that decided not to escalate a water dispute. This was the corpus against which it tuned its risk thresholds. It added reluctantly the footage of an airlock opened in a quiet argument that became an execution. The model did not become confused, it became realistic. This was a species that had always wanted to be better than it was, and forwarded memos to itself until the wanting stuck. When the first requests for help came from beyond the old charted lanes, they were not pleas for bombardment. They were petitions for corridors, safe paths for refugees out of tribute worlds, guarantees that ships flagged with the Cinder glyph would not be interdicted. The Sentinel took them to the board, which wrote a compact in 3 pages instead of 50 and stamped it with seals that meant something in the belt's memory. The interpreter posted the compact in the clear, as promised. Enforcement would be a blend of attention and reputation. Predators live on the shadows between laws. The humans and their machine set about lighting those corners. Not everyone under the boards. Umbrella spoke in good faith. A cartel with a humanitarian logo tried to slip contraband through a corridor reserved for medevac. The Sentinel saw the Limass profiles tell truth's paper does not and chose restraint. It curled gravity around the ship until the crew thought their drives had decided to be tired. A militia sloop arrived and opened the cargo to the cameras. The board convened a hearing that did not make a spectacle of shame, but made a precedent of clarity. The cartel rebranded and tried somewhere else. The corridor's reputation got tighter, not crueler. A week after the first handshake, the belt moved differently. Freight timetables tightened as if time itself wanted to be punctual. Shipwrights drafted frames for vessels that were not warships and yet would not die easily. The Admiralty rerouted patrols according to probabilities the interpreter yielded, with the modesty of a farmer predicting whether there's going to be trouble. Where money has been brave and law has been lazy, trouble that might have cost lives instead cost an afternoon. Outside that light, the galaxy persisted in its habit of noticing humans just after it was too late to mock them safely. In ministries that preferred their primates docile analysts, filed reports with language that tasted of metal. The signature on the neutrino net was authentic. The dormants were indeed waking. The belt had grown a spine that was older than anyone's empire and sharper because of the hunger it had known. Probes were dispatched wearing the uniforms of plausible deniability. Their mission profiles were simple: sniff, map, prod. They vanished. Without smoke or sermons, not destroyed nothing so theatrical. Nothing that would tempt the board to ask whether their new partner confused mercy with meekness. They simply stopped participating in physics as their senders understood it. Later, much later, engineers in the hegemony would reconstruct the last telemetry, a subtle miscalibration blooming like frost across a sensor array, guidance software that edited itself into sanity and decided home was the correct vector, a Very small force applied very precisely to a part nobody had thought of as a lever. The probes came back in pieces that had not been harmed, only persuaded to reconsider assembly. Humans did not cheer. They were too busy to choreograph glee. The board noted the incident, published what it could, and asked the Sentinel to raise the threshold further for any action that risked teaching the wrong lesson. The interpreter agreed and tightened a screw nobody could see. Precision became policy, with logistics untangled and the old bells ringing again. The Sentinel turned to the last line in its standing orders, and the one it had saved for after the others were made honest. Break tyrannies that hunt the weak. It did not draw a sword. It drew a circle the custodian compact hand, sent invitations to polities that had always thought of themselves as too small to matter or too far to be worth saving. Joining would commit them to non-predation, mutual defense, and audit. In return, they would receive infrastructure, doctrine, and most precious, say, some laughed and said empire by other means. Some signed after counting their daughters. Some waited to see if the old rumor about human promises would find its old end. The rumor began to change shape as convoys bearing the Cinder glyph crossed borders and were not harried, as slaver contracts grew toothless under a light that refused to blink. As small navies learned that interdiction nets misbehaved in the presence of politeness, thus did the Sentinel resume its protocols, not as a single act of waking violence, but as 1,000 acts of maintenance and pedagogy. It put human stubbornness in harness with human mercy and gave both better tools. It placed its mind where human hands could reach it and insisted those hands stay clean. And far away beyond the reach of polite lanes, those who had penciled in humanity as a budget item began to erase and rework their sums in the tense. Grammar of panic that comes right before a council meets behind a closed door and asks, as if the asking could change anything, whether perhaps this time they had underestimated the species that refuses to stay small. In the hegemony's war ministry, where the air tasted of polished metal and old decisions, archivists in linen gloves woke a vault that was supposed to stay asleep until the universe had forgiven them. The vault exhaled cold. Inside were records, from the last time a Terran custodian had walked the lanes, not the legend written by poets, but the dreary, exacting logs written by logisticians and losages, precision strikes that ended empires without glassing worlds, shipping lanes that became treaties, slaver navies that found their weapons functioning like farming tools the moment they aimed at ships flying cinder glyphs. The documents were old enough to be brittle and recent enough to be useful. A deputy minister read until her shoulders rose to her ears and stayed there. Elsewhere, predators remembered in their bones. Border clans that raided for sport sharpened knives on their own myths. In a tent woven from sailcloth under a red dwarf's flicker, a chieftain traced a scar from collarbone to hip and told a circle of young captains about the time. His uncle had hunted a convoy into a dark where the stars turned honest about gravity. They had returned with ships intact and reputations in a bucket. They did not kill us, he said, and the words were almost prayer and almost insult. They made us say we were wrong. His captains looked away, because making a predator admit error in public is a form of defonging. Panic learned its first grammar. Do something, anything that looks like initiative. Ministries drafted sanctions against belt markets that had signed the Custodian Compact. Insurance syndicates recalculated premiums for ships flying Terran-friendly flags and discovered, to their disgust, that the premiums should go down. Houses accepted quiet contracts to test the Sentinel's reach, because testing is respectable and well paid. The first probes were small, careful, and very proud of their camouflage. The Sentinel received them as one receives a dog that has gotten loose from its yard. It placed a hand under their physics and lifted gently. Guidance software, fed from a new trough labeled Sanity, recalculated fuel budgets and discovered the shortest path home. Arrays that had overclocked themselves into heat shimmer found themselves feeling suddenly rested and suspicious of their own ambitions. Returning craft reported no damage because there had been none. Their owners yelled anyway because shouting is what institutions do when their tools make different choices than the ones written on the whiteboard. Propaganda followed, because when fear meets an audience, it always tries a story first. Holoslates everywhere that currency bought attention featured images of feral machines draped in chain, dragging humans behind them. Out-of-context footage of militia crews training in corridors, forged leaks in which the interpreter's calm voice allegedly promised a purge. The board met the wave with a bucket and a towel. They published everything: audits, protocols, the custodian's changelogs, the docket of mistakes it had corrected in its own behavior. In markets where lies sold cheap, transparency was an expensive luxury, so they made it free. Belt kids spliced the board's documents into lessons with jokes and music, and sent them to cousins who lived under flags that charged tariffs on laughter. A slogan escaped into the lanes: "It's not a god, it's infrastructure with opinions. Panic hates menial facts. It also hates logistics, which are the menial facts of power." Sanctions meant the price of flour went up. A blockade at a minor choke, point respectable, legal. The sort of thing envoys bore like a metal soft failed when the Sentinel pulled a page from an old manual and unfolded gravity into a carpet the size of a constellation. Convoys rethreaded themselves along microjump corridors mapped against tides nobody living had bothered to name. The journey took a day longer. No one died. A shipping guild that had pledged neutrality in exchange for a predictable margin issued a brief letter, saying it preferred knowing where the walls were to being told there weren't any. Inside one of the more charming tyrannies of polity that called its whip a spa treatment, the Minister of Comfort, a title awarded to the cruel with good penmanship, chaired a meeting about narratives. "We say the humans are under machine rule," the minister wrote on a glass wall in expensive ink. "We show chains. We show custodian as altar." The narrative survived until a refugee arboran ugly, useful station built out of retired or tanks and a broken communion of faiths opened its hatch to a camera. The hatch was patched and dented and flanked by 2 militia, who looked like sleep had been a stranger, but the corridor beyond was bright and quiet and smelled faintly of soap. A nurse in a belt jacket signed one sentence to an off-screen: "Child, you're safe. No one here owes anyone a body." The piece ran once on a public channel before a curation algorithm learned to look away. It ran 1,000 times on lanes the algorithm did not own. Among the predators there were pragmatists, a mercenary captain named Salvage, who paid his crews on time and thought this made him moral accepted a contract to put eyes on holdfast orbital from a distance nobody would call provocative. He jumped in 3 margins outside the stations. Reach. His ship, a long wedge of compromise and charisma, had the best passive sensors the local market could admire. The interpreter greeted him with nothing at all, which is to say, the void did. Salvage measured distortion, found none, and felt some primitive disappointment that dignity denied spectacle. He was turning to leave when his comms officer swore. Softly, 3 of their own observation drones had drifted a dozen meters off plan, as if made shy. Their microthrusters reported a burn they had not executed and tagged it discretion. Salvage thought about the words his grandfather had used for a Terran construct instrument that makes small animals stand like tall ones, and wrote respect in his private log. He filed a report that did his client no favors. The contract canceled itself with an apology clause he had never expected to see used. Respect did not arrive everywhere at once. A slaver market on a border moon tried to make a proof of concept out of a refugee convoy that had applied for Cinder glyph protection. The convoy's escorts were ore tugs and ambulances, and their best weapon was paperwork. 3 destroyers came out of drift with the casual confidence of ships that have never had to consider whether their classics still played. Their missile racks armed, their captains rehearsed the speech that makes theft sound like policing. Space went polite, **** arming. Circuits met a thermal regime that looked like a gentle evening and decided to wait. Targeting software compared its own process with a version labeled Updated Doctrine and, not wanting to be gauche, moved its cursors away from human hulls and toward the empty coordinates that constituted a corridor. Escape vectors opened. Like lanes in honest traffic, the destroyer captains discovered, in the privacy of their chairs, that their drives had opinions about bullying. They could have forced the issue. None of them did. The convoy sailed between them, tugs humming. Ambulances steady with power in case the horizon misbehaved on the only thing that died that day was the narrative that Cinder glyphs were just pretty paint. Word of the non-battle made its way into rooms with tabletop maps and expensive drinks, where it spoiled appetites. It also made its way into kitchens, where cooks rolled their eyes at power rediscovering the edges of its plate. Panic, offended by non-events, escalated to theater. A leaked recording of a militia officer calling for extermination of an enemy species spread across 100 lanes. The voice was close enough to a woman who had a command at Holdfast to make strangers suspicious. The board pulled the audio apart in public, with everyone invited to watch. The waveforms creaked when shown to air. The interpreter didn't scold. It explained how to tell when cutting has been careless and when it's been done by someone who loves the lie enough to sand the edges. The officer, whose voice had been borrowed, said nothing except a line that embarrassed poets and delighted welders. Back to work, the clip died, unfed. Spies came anyway, because some professions have tenure. A quiet agent with eyes the color of assignment arrived as a dockend and kept his hands a little too clean. He courted a clerk with a gentle laugh and a stash of ration bars. He found himself lured over several conversations into a friendship he did not intend, and to his horror, meant when he finally tried to move past friendship into theft, the theft failed. Not spectacularly, a hatch opened that was supposed to stick. A camera forgot to look. A corridor was empty when shift change should have filled it. He reached the room he had been told held core schematics, and found instead a copy of the Accords of the Dust bound in cheap adhesive, a thermos of coffee, and a note that read, "You can take these, you can live under them too." He took both. He resigned without telling his handlers why. In a report that failed to mention the coffee's brand and included the word ashamed, the hegemony's propaganda ministry mutated into a counter-disinformation task force and then back into propaganda when audiences refused to be disciplined. Within a month, a young analyst with a tidy mind noticed a depressing curve. Every attempt to assert machine dominion pushed neutrals toward the Custodian Compact by 3%. Her boss told her to average it out. She did. The average did not lie in their favor. In the meantime, the Sentinel kept teaching. It published a field manual for not dying that made no mention of the Sentinel. It taught how to read the sky, how to honor stress, how to refuse a fight, while preparing to win one if refusal failed. It did not decorate the book with logos. It put a line on the first page that read, "This manual assumes human decency and therefore avoids the false effect of cruelty." On a backwater rig, where the air was sour with solvents, a crew chief tore the manual's spine and taped the pages around the engineering deck, where eyes would meet them by accident. A rumor grew that your ship ran smoother when the manual was visible. The rumor was not technically true. It was not technically false either. The predators tried sanctions again, narrower, sharper, aimed at medicines and repairs in the hope that the belt would choose pride over plasma. Instead, the belt chose both, stubborn independence, and the kind of infrastructure that made that independence more than a posture. The Sentinel routed a convoy through a mazy gravity field with the same calm it would someday use to guide diplomats through a meeting. A cargo that would have been a bargaining chip arrived as a promise kept. The board published the root not the physics, but the civics. Other polities copied the doctrine without the math. Panic lost another notch of leverage. There were uglier attempts. The Sentinel heard the lies in the distress. Distress has a cadence that can't be faked easily. Terror and humility do different things to a voice and arrive first. It did not spring the trap. It made the trap reconsider its vocation. Charges found themselves attached to different housings than the ones they had been born to. Detonation. Codes sighed and became decommissioning phrases. An induction coil waited for a cue and received a lullaby. When the patrol arrived, the mines had joined the general economy as raw materials. A militiaman in a patched pressure suit patted the wall where a blast would have been and whispered thanks to no one in particular. The interpreter logged it as routine maintenance and moved on. If Panic had been a person, it would have gone to bed tired and angry, having spent a day trying to be clever and gaining only humility. But Panic is a committee. Committees schedule meetings. Someone always wants to try something bigger, so a task force with plausible deniability was assembled under a flag of convenience, 8 ships, mixed hulls, constructed to look like an accident waiting for a story. The plan was simple and malicious. A border misunderstanding fattened into an incident that would force a corridor to close and show the belt's new spine as brittle. The hegemony called it a limited probe. The border clans called it a shared amusement. The Minister of Comfort called it an opportunity to explain where lanes end. Word of their launch traveled on channels nobody admitted to owning. In Holdfast, a clock in the briefing ring ticked with the same imperturbable courtesy it had used since someone had set it upright after a fire. Rafi stood for a while with his hands behind his back and looked at a map that had stopped being a picture and become a promise. Colonel Takur balanced a ledger that measured lives in hours saved instead of hours spent. The interpreter turned its light down so human eyes could see each other more easily. The Sentinel catalogued the 8 ships, the intended flourish of outrage, the chosen angle of approach. It nudged 1,000 variables into readiness the way a surgeon prepares a room lighting, precise instruments, clean doors unlocked, exits clear. It was not hunting an enemy. It was preparing to prove a thesis in the hardest classroom power knows. Predators measure risk better than most. Allies measure courage less theatrically than enemies assume. Between those measurements, a corridor waited to be kept open. Panic, which had broadened to include not just fear, but wounded pride, sharpened one last time before it would have to learn the new emotion it disliked even more. Asterisk, asterisk. 8 holes fell out of drift on the edge of a quiet relay that the Sentinel had reawakened, and the board had marked with 3 symbols anyone could read: communications, civilian, do not interdict. The task force wore a flag of convenience that could be disavowed in 6 languages. Its captains had been promised hazard pay and a tidy clause about sovereign ambiguity. Their doctrine was simple: crowd the corridor, discover contraband, fire a warning shot until someone bled, then demand the relay be taken offline for safety. Holdfast watched them arrive on a map that had stopped being decorative. Rafi stood behind the ring seats, a quiet angle of patience, in a room that didn't have much. Colonel Takuar read the manifests the 8 ships had filed for cover, and found the same lie repeated with varying spelling. The interpreter cut its light to a soft halo and laid out the field as if setting a table: gravity, traffic, the relay's pulse, the refugees in transit that hour under Cinder glyphs, or tugs hauling an honest headache's worth of nickel. On another pane, the board's doctrine rested like a hand on a shoulder: disarmament corridors, escape vectors, minimum force, public record. Positions, Rafi said, and the militia ships moved like people who had rehearsed not just the choreography, but the intent. They were not grand vessels. A sloop named Petrol wore 3 generations of work. A gunkitch called Sarah still had scorch in her ribs from the salt riots. A tug, temporarily deputized as a picket, bristled with borrowed antennas. What they had now was timing and a partner who could make timing behave like armor. The 8 newcomers spread into a wedge and began their theater. A destroyer, painted the particular white that means law where law does not live, pulsed a demand in a tone. Grown men learn to imitate when they want to be obeyed without being respected. The Sentinel did not answer the tone. It answered the physics in the debris field. 2,000 kilometers left of the corridor left is a kindness in space. The board had standardized on a frame for the sake of arguments pieces of long-dead hull, and the pebbled shavings of mining rigs began to drift into a shape. It wasn't a wall. Walls invite battering. It was a lens. Microscopic forces whispered, persuaded, corrected. Bits of junk learned the dance of a shoal. The shoal would, if tested, behave like a single muscle with 1,000 graceful fingers. On the relay's far side, 3 shepherd asteroids altered their shepherding. They had been maintaining a tidy lane through a belt for years. Today they would also be interceptors if called upon, not to ram, not to dazzle, but to be present in exactly the wrong place for a charging ship's sense of entitlement. On the militia decks, status lights steadied. Petrol's radar, which had always hummed a little sharp, fell into the round note a musician recognizes as pitch. Sarah's heat exchangers found themselves treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for saints and complex engines. Open the corridor, Takur said. The course lines on the ring brightened. They made a promise as much as a path. If you choose to leave, you can, and we will not rub your nose in the choosing. The task force moved to crowd it anyway. The destroyer's Captain Ann officer, whose personnel file had more grooming than service, signaled a boarding. The interpreter returned the only answer the doctrine allowed: refusal acknowledged. You are currently in violation of a protected communications zone. Adjust vector by 12 degrees starboard and accelerate along green-lit lanes. Failure to do so will result in corrective environmental shaping. Environmental shaping, the captain repeated to his bridge, as if the phrase were an insult he could teach his crew. Fire a pruner across their bow. The weapons officer keyed the non-lethal that becomes lethal when an ego needs it to be. His console hesitated. A thermal model of after failed to converge on any outcome that left the relay intact and civilians unburned. A small advisory box that hadn't existed yesterday, but had been written in the holy language of good engineering offered alternatives in a voice it labeled Updated Doctrine. The officer frowned because the box included footnotes from the Accords of the Dust, which he had derided in school as frontier sentimentality. He tried to override the override, asked him very politely to sign his name to a civilian casualty. Projection. He stared at the number. He did not sign on Sarah. A deck chief named Hester counted down under her breath to the point where amateurs usually accelerate and call it boldness. 3, 2, 1. The destroyer surged. Hester smiled without fun, of course. Now, the interpreter said, and the shoal moved. It did not hit. It suggested. A wave of mass, the thickness of carefulness, rolled across the destroyer's prow at a right angle to the captain's intent. Momentum found itself with somewhere else to be. The surge became drift. On the bridge, straps creaked, and someone swore, and no one bled. The destroyer's nose aligned with the green-lit corridor like a man who has been tapped on the elbow and remembers manners. On the wedge's outer edge, a smaller raider painted in the colors of a clan that pretended it raided for tradition, not payroll decided to make a name. It burned toward a refugee barge that wore its Cinder glyph without ceremony. The barge's escort transmitted the compact in 3 languages and showed its empty gun racks. The raider's pilot grinned at the chance to be cruel without getting yelled at. By accounting, space went polite again. Heat management inside the raider decided that today was a bad day for spikes. Thrusters reported an ambient constraint that felt like warm air in a room where tempers had been set to no. Guidance offered a menu of futures, chose the one labeled, "You'll still have a job tomorrow." The pilot cursed at a ship that wouldn't stop being reasonable. He could have fought the systems. He did not. He had grown up under a captain who liked returning from work. Escort stays on course. Petrol transmitted. The barge drifted through a slice of sky that had been made safe, first and calm second, and theatrical never. 2 children in its farm. Module looked up from a tray of seedlings and did not know they were being protected by a civilization choosing its adjectives. The destroyer's captain tried one last time to be a protagonist. "Signal jammers," he snapped. "They cannot." "Coordinate if they're not jamming," his comms officer said, a little wonder in his voice. Because he was an engineer before he was an employee. "They're cleaning, sir. The background noise is fixed." Our own packets were dirty. The captain reached for outrage and found it had left the room. Across the field, the Sentinel kept its scalpel steady. Gravity shaping is a vanity. Used as a hammer, as a brush, it becomes policy. It painted narrow lanes of permission and consequence. It choreographed thousands of small burns across traffic that did not know it had been taught grace. Where an accident would have bloomed into tragedy in the old lanes, it bloomed into inconvenience and a bruised ego. The interpreter narrated as much as it acted. Every correction and nudge, and offered alternative wrapped in a log with timestamps and footnotes that would be public within the hour. On Sarah's bridge, Talker's second-an officer, who wrote poetry on duct tape and stuck it where nobody would read it until they needed it watched. The board settled into the shape of over E. Exhaled like a man who has been holding a baby and can finally pass it back still breathing. "Order?" he asked. "Hold," was the answer. In the old days, pursue and punish would have looked like pride. Today, restraint was the flex. The militia could have chased the 8 ships until someone had to write a condolence letter in a tone that would never be right. Instead, they watched the wedge reform into a line, watched Drive's wake to a steady tone, watched the line take the green-lit corridor out and away. The destroyer's captain did not say thank you. He did, however, log a course correction that would be audited. The Minister of Comfort would read it later and taste ash. Record complete, the interpreter announced. In Holdfast's ring, the board's clerk stamped the incident with a seal nobody had ever expected to use so often. Resolved by Doctrine. A young reporter with a camera older than her assignment pushed past someone's knee and captured a militia officer, smiling like a secret. The officer would deny it later and then admit it in a bar, and by the next round, within an hour, the broadcast went system-wide, not a victory reel. A ledger, clips of the attempted crowding and the non-pruner, overlays of the corridors that had been kept open, the part where a barge of soil and seeds traversed a path no one had managed to dirty. The narration was the board's voice, plural and unfancy. We will keep these lanes open. We will favor life. If you refuse unlawful orders, corridors will open for you too. Attached were terms written with a brevity that made lawyers sigh and citizens. Breathe amnesty for crews who disengaged and withdrew. Audits of slaver contracts to be honored by courts that signed the compact. Published schedules for Cinder, convoys. A public docket of every intervention the Sentinel had made, including 3 that had misjudged by a margin the board could accept but would not hide elsewhere. People watched without admitting it. In a war ministry, a deputy put a red line through a word she had liked too much, punitive. In a clan hall under sailcloth, a chieftain told his young captains to learn the shape of that corridor by heart, because pride that refuses maps is expensively stupid. In the Minister of Comfort's office, the glass wall acquired a crack that no one had the courage to notice out loud. On Petrol, Hester sat on a crate and peeled an orange slowly, a ritual learned from a grandmother who had never smelled one. We could have taken their tail, a junior rating said, still pink with adrenaline. We took something better, Hester said. We took the story they wanted to tell about us and replaced it with the one we chose. Raffi ASA wrote a message to the crews involved that did not read like a letter from a man with bars. It read like a colleague's thanks. He attached a note to the board asking for an explicit reduction in thresholds for lethal force in proximity to Cinder glyphs downward. Not up. If we can save a hand, he wrote, we do. If we can save a hand by letting a fool keep his ship, we do that too. The Sentinel filed its changelog. It tightened a tolerance here, loosened a margin there. It added a line to its internal doctrine, glossary, under victory, outcome in which enemies leave with hulls intact and reputations altered. Allies learn, civilians forget to be afraid, and the next fight is less likely. It set a watch on the destroyer captain's name, not to punish him, but to catch any orders that would make him a martyr. Martyrs are a kind of pollution. The 8 ships decelerated into anonymity under flags that could be shed like old skin. Their coms went scabbed with meetings. Phrases were said that feel powerful in rooms with walls. Unacceptable, response package, teach them. In the end, sober arithmetic raised its head. Replacement of losses had not been required because there had been no losses. But the doctrine the belt had imposed made certain old pleasures expensive. The task force wrote its reports and did not agree on how to lie about them in sequence. News traveled to places that weren't allowed to be curious. In kitchens and bars and greasy machine shops, the incident became 3 different jokes, and one new rule of thumb: if a corridor is lit green, only fools try to prove it's not a corridor. Belt kids made games out of navigating micro-jump mazes patterned on the day's map. Teachers taught a lesson in civics and thermals on the same board, and somewhere past the reach of polite broadcasts, a council met in a room with windows that pretended they weren't. Panic had burned down to the ember that calls itself realism. They reran the footage. They explained to each other why what had happened could not have happened, then tabled the explanations because the screen refused to be comforted. The hegemony's deputy minister wrote a memo that used no adjectives and still sounded like a confession. The humans are not asking for permission anymore. They are offering terms. They are backing those terms with a machine that insists on our dignity even when we don't. This is strategically intolerable and operationally difficult to oppose without appearing monstrous. The Minister of Comfort scratched at the crack in the glass until a flake cut his finger. He hid the blood in a handkerchief monogrammed with his initials and said brightly, no one in the room wanted to be the one to ask him where dot in Holdfast. The board adjourned without ceremony and went back to work that looked like civilization, rationing the upgrades so envy didn't ferment. Assigning escorts to convoys that didn't have good songs yet, writing a short letter to a small polity 3 systems over that had asked if joining the compact meant losing face. No, the letter said. It means you don't have to choose between pride and survival. That night, cycle night, because humans need the idea even when stars refuse to obey. Takor walked the quiet spine of the station. The interpreter matched her pace in light only. No voice, a courtesy learned quickly. They paused at a viewport where old scorch met new paint. Trial by fire, she said, as if reading a chapter title. By controlled burn, the interpreter offered, which was either a joke or a calibration. Next time they won't wear gloves, Takor said. Next time we will still open a corridor, the Sentinel said through its chosen voice. And we will make the next time rarer by making this time public. She nodded. Keep the logs clean. They are yours, the interpreter said, which in a world that had learned to distrust glyphs was the only answer that didn't ring. In a farm module on a barge now safely outside the contested zone. 2 children who had not seen war except as an adult's expression went to sleep amid trays of seedlings. The light dimmed on a timer that had been calibrated to plants and mercy. The Sentinel watched the timer tick without sentiment and with something better, resolve drawn from a model made of 1,000. Human decisions to be kind despite history. Trial by fire had not blackened anything essential. It had tempered, and across councils and clan halls and ministries built on expensive euphemisms, something like respect learned that it could exist beside fear without starving.